How's it going, guys? Conviction 454 here. And this video, I wanted to talk about the Microsoft Security Operations Analyst exam, or otherwise the Microsoft SC-200 exam. I actually took the exam almost a month ago, and I meant to make a video on this particular exam really after I took it, but I had some things going on to where I just didn't really have the time for videos. But anyways, just to talk a little bit about my experience, I would say this exam here was fairly challenging. I would say it was a little bit easier than the AZ-104 though. The AZ-104, maybe it's just because at the time when I took the AZ-104, I didn't really have a lot of like in-depth exposure or experience with Azure yet. I had just taken the AZ-900. Well, actually, I took the AZ-900 about, I want to say, 5 to 6 months before I took the AZ-104. But the AZ-104 was a completely different animal. I actually made a video on that a while back. If you guys want to check that out, if you haven't already. But back to the talking about the SC-200. So, as you guys know, of course, you can kind of infer by the name that this is a security-oriented exam. I haven't taken the AZ-500 yet, so I don't really know how it compares to that exam in particular. But what I will say in regards to the specifics of the SC-200 is that it is very like security operations center oriented, and it is very deep into Sentinel and KQL, incident response, and things of that nature. And so the exam is very, I would say, scenario driven, similar to how the CYSA Plus was, except of course this time you're going to be, exclusively in an Azure environment. And so just to give you a little bit background in terms of my experience level, just to give you a clear picture, I've never worked in a SOC before. I don't really have like any sort of like in-depth security experience. I've worked 5 to 6 years at this point in like IT support and about 2 years in like systems administration. So security is a fundamental portion of what I do for a living, but it's not really the center focus as opposed to where a SOC analyst would be looking at alerts all day. And then, of course, investigating and using their various tools in order to resolve cyber incidents or triage, depending which level they're at. But for this exam in particular, you definitely have to know your KQL. So what I would suggest you do is create a free Azure tenant, and then instead of me telling you to go figure out how to actually do that and how to actually like practice KQL, I actually do have some videos on this particular channel that kind of goes over KQL just a little bit at the surface level, so you have an idea of how you actually deploy Sentinel, deploy KQL, and whatnot. Now, just to give you a heads up, specifically for setting up Sentinel, it can get pretty pricey. So if you are going to like configure a Azure tenant and then deploy Sentinel and then start practicing KQL and then data and log ingestion, it can get pretty pricey. But I do believe that for the first 30 days you can upload about, I want to say, I forgot how much. I think it might have been like 500 megs of data in terms of logs per day for free for the first 30 days when you use Sentinel. Don't quote me on that. I actually don't remember. But I actually had a Sentinel lab completely set up. Not necessarily for this exam. It's just because I've been trying to pivot into cybersecurity. And so that exposure before taking the exam definitely helps. Now, you don't have to be an expert at KQL, but you definitely have to know the basics, like know what different types of tables that you can query, to know the different types of parameters you can use to filter different logs. It does get into a fairly good amount of detail in those subjects. Now, as for more of the incident response thing, it's pretty. I'm not going to say standard, but it kind of sort of. If you've taken like the Security Plus, for example, then that knowledge should help you to a degree with this exam, even though Security Plus isn't necessarily a Microsoft exam. But just kind of having that sort of, and I say this very loosely, like common sense sort of security understanding, that definitely helps. So I would say this actually is not an entry-level cybersecurity certification. It's probably more towards mid-level, similar to the CISA was. So if you haven't taken your Security Plus yet, or you're brand new to cybersecurity, I wouldn't recommend that you start with this exam because it did get pretty challenging. In terms of anything else I saw on the exam, like I said, it was really, really scenario heavy. So like I said, just make sure you understand your KQL. Make sure you understand like risk management and incident response at least a very basic level. And then if you do that, and I would say, like I said, if you're brand new to cybersecurity, don't start here. But if you have experience with Azure in particular, like if you understand like how virtual machines are deployed, you understand resource groups and redundancy and things of that nature. This exam doesn't really like get in depth into necessarily the features of what Azure has, more so like how do you actually respond to an incident when an incident occurs. And so that's where I feel like it really differentiates from the AZ-500 when it comes to objectives anyway, is that the AZ-500 really covers a more broader sense of Azure security, whereas for the SC-200 you're looking specifically at incidents. And so I would keep your like study strategy wrapped around that ideology of when an incident does come in, like let's say a virtual machine was compromised, for example, or a SQL database was, accessed without, authorized permission. Like, what would be the first thing that you do? What would be the sort of like mitigation steps that you would take? What would you do at like the policy level to really like prevent attacks from happening? And also having a little bit of knowledge on things like Microsoft like Copilot for security, how that works, what sorts of implementations you can do with that. What can you do with logic apps when it comes to like security alerts? How do you actually set up a security alert? And like I said before, I actually have some videos that cover a lot of these different concepts, at least at a surface level. Unfortunately, I wanted to go deeper into the lab, but because of the like free trial and everything, it's only like 30 days, and then after that, I had to start paying paying a good bit of money for just keeping the lab set up. Because again, the way that I have it set up is I have like an entire like home lab with Windows endpoints, Linux endpoints. I still have that portion of the lab, but like the Azure part of it isn't really integrated into it anymore. But like I really had like really an entire enterprise environment almost, but not really. And then I had like some data collection rules set up. I had a pfSense firewall configured, and then what I was doing was I had a Linux box that was being used as a middleman to collect the firewall logs through syslog from the Linux middleman VM into Azure. And so I have a GitHub, and I have again videos on here on this channel. If you guys want to use that, which I kind of recommend that you do, not to say, because of course it really would help the channel. That would really help me out in terms of like increasing viewership and whatnot. But I would really appreciate that if you guys watch those videos. And I really do think they would help you with the exam as well. So I would say, again, it is a pretty, I'm not going to say super difficult, but it's definitely an exam that you want to study for. And one of the main reasons why I wanted to make this video is because if you look around YouTube, you don't really see a whole lot of content readily available for this particular exam. I'm not really sure why that is. Maybe it's not exactly, as in demand as something like the AZ-500. But I will say that for those who are also looking to get into security, I have seen the SC-200 mentioned for like SOC analyst or cybersecurity analyst positions, and I really think it should be mentioned because the main reason, why you get certification in the first place is because of like the skills it offers. And so I would say if you're looking to become a SOC analyst in particular, then this is a certification that you should look at. If you don't want to take the exam, then I would say at least learn Azure Sentinel, at least learn like Microsoft Purview and how Sentinel integrates into that. And at least, at the very least, learn about really just the different sorts of security options you have available in Azure. And maybe you're not really an Azure person at all. Maybe you're AWS. Well, I would say, like when it comes to cloud platforms and whatnot, I think you should learn at least two. Of course, other people say you should really just learn one and master one, but that's going on a bit of a tangent. But anyways, in terms of the score that I got, I believe I scored because I took it almost a month ago. I think it was a 755 or like a 740 around that. So I didn't get like the greatest score at all. And truth be told, I probably could have studied a little bit longer for this exam. I studied for about, I'll say like, if you've watched my previous videos, you know that I tend to study on and off when it comes to certs because of other things going on in my life. But I would say overall about 3 months or so. Two like serious months of studying, and then just yeah. So anyways, in terms of the resources that I used, I looked at John Christopher on Udemy's. I looked at his course, and then I also took some practice questions from Tutorial Dojo. So usually when it comes to Microsoft exams, I only use two resources. Well, three. I use Microsoft Learn as well, but only loosely. Truth be told, I feel like Microsoft Learn is useful, but I think it's just a really like long, like several pages of text, and me personally, I just struggle with learning that way. I'm more hands-on, and I also like to learn, visually through videos. That's just me, but some of you may be able to handle Microsoft Learn a little bit better than me. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about this exam. I am going to leave a link for those videos for the Microsoft like Sentinel Lab that I've been doing in the description. And then hopefully you guys can use that. And also, again, I'll leave a link for Tutorial Dojo as well for their practice exams, because I really think those are like the go-to practice exams. I think there's one called Measure Up as well. They're pretty similar. But yeah, so all resources will be available in the description. As usual, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.